like you had just come upon this in a practice hall. Slide, please. Degas would do many of these off-balance compositions. This is supposedly a portrait, but who other than an impressionist, or who other even than Degas, in doing a portrait would place the lady so far off in the composition, and even then glancing out of the page? It would seem that your eye would be interested in following her stare and completely leave the composition, except this painting is dominated such by the huge mass of flowers that it continually calls your attention back into the painting. The Impressionists were very interested in this overall pattern, as Monet was in sort of an overall texture. Slide, please. Another early Degas, and this is the complete composition, not just the detail. The horse and carriage pulled way down into the lower right-hand portion of the composition. And as with many of the Impressionists at this time, the contrast of dark areas to light areas. Slide, please. Degas had a love of horses. He could sketch them, he knew their anatomy, he sketched people constantly, and then he would go indoors to a studio to create his paintings and his compositions. This one is greatly influenced by the Japanese prints that were invading Paris at that time, because most of the details are simplified. The horses may become silhouette shapes. The ground has very little pattern in it, or very little change in tone, with the exception of sort of nice silhouette blurry shadows that create a depth or a distance. Of course, as the horses are lined up, your eye immediately sort of goes down the channel to the horse that seems to be out of control in the far background. Notice the architecture. He obviously worked many times at this racing park. Also, with many of the Impressionists, with this sort of splashy use of color, the introduction of an outline or a holding line or an edge came into effect. They had to establish an edge some way, and this, especially with Degas, and his love of drawing, was right up his alley. Slide, please. Degas worked in many mediums, not only oil first of all, but then he switched to watercolor, and then many times highlighted it with pastels, or worked mostly, sometimes completely in pastels, using the texture of the paper as Seurat does with his charcoals to sort of get this blurry, pointillist effect. But you achieve a texture this way using a rough paper without blending it. Sometimes he would put in a watercolor wash base, establishing the forms, and then highlight it with the colored chalks. Slide, please. This is another scene at the same race park that we had seen earlier. But notice how the texture of the canvas, just sort of an even tone, broken up with sort of an all-over texture, and then just the basic silhouette shadow effect of the horses, giving the depth or distance needed. The detail, even though it is simplified, is absolutely correct. Slide, please. In many of his compositions, Degas would bring something and shove it out of the edge of the composition. This sort of involves you in the painting. Things become so close that you have the feeling that they continue outside the picture plane, and that you're sort of standing right in the midst of all the activity that's going on. Sometimes you almost feel like you're on a horse itself within the race. Slide, please. As in this one, you absolutely feel like you're right among the riders. Many of his paintings were tiny little subject matters. Okay,
slide, please. And clear.
like all the artists of all times, there is never one that has been more delightful and charming than Pierre-Auguste Renoir, R-E-N-O-I-R. He portrayed the late 19th century French life in the city, basically Paris, its delights, its visual delights, the happiness, the beauty, the sort of peaceful tranquility of the period, never showing anything that was out of taste or out of character, but presenting things in a very visually beautiful manner as he saw it. He never portrayed sadness. All of his paintings were rich in color with the grace and the beauty of that time of life. The first painting that we see is a group portrait of Madame Carpentier and her two little girls, with the use of the Impressionist color, that sort of vibrancy of intermingling tones, primary tones that give a richness. Renoir uses it sort of as Angers did with his more slick classical style of richness in fabrics and folds. There's the same sort of opulence in an entirely different manner of technique of Renoir, but it has sort of the same richness effect that Angers got in his earlier classic portraits. True, the colors are sort of more soft and hazy, the outline's not as distinct, but in the same way they present the same type or class of people. In this one, the rich rusty red background is a ground color that Renoir used many times in his paintings. Highlights just sort of fuzz out of darkness, as in the little girl's hair, where you really don't know where the hair stops and the background starts. But there's a beautiful grace, and yet there's this casual look that was so much a part of Impressionist composition, of where everybody is relaxed. There's an informal feeling to this painting, even though, dressed up as they are, you know it's a quite formalized portrait. Madame Carpentier's face, although it's very individualized, and you know that she must have looked like this, is still sort of stylized into Renoir's individual technique. He painted beautiful women. He loved to see the beauty of light falling on the surface of a beautiful skin. It's almost a translucent or a white porcelain effect. Most of the times, his women have hair, sort of auburn-colored hair, much as the little girls have, very white porcelain skin, and fairly wide-set dark eyes, so that you almost have a stylized presentation of the female face, as, say, Da Vinci stylized his female figures. Slide, please. As with the Impressionist brushwork, it became sort of scratchy, sketchy, quickly applied. Renoir did many, many paintings during his lifetime, some of them just the merest notations in color. He also drew, he did some etchings also, but the sort of rich, rusty-colored background or rusty-haired women is sort of typical of most of his paintings. They're quick impressions. He was really a true impressionist, but more in this sort of delightful vein rather than an intellectual vein of a search of light falling on the surface of objects. He wanted to present a beautifully visual world. Slide, please. Probably his two most famous paintings, the Evening in Paris and the Luncheon of the Boating Party, which you see on the screen now, is a very carefully ranged casual painting. It looks like a modern-day snapshot, or beautiful in color. This is that favorite little area outside of Paris where many of the Impressionist painters gathered. We've seen the little striped scalloped awning in some of Monet's paintings. In this, you have a very casual arrangement of people that are finishing up a luncheon, having a good time. And yet it is known that each one of these people were carefully arranged and asked to pose for this composition. This painting is fairly large, about 4 by 6 feet, and it's in the Phillips collection in Washington. There's a strong sort of reddish underglow to this painting, as if he
stained his canvas with a burnt sienna color first before applying the other paint. There's a richness of color, each one sort of unaware that the painter is painting them, and yet if you sort of notice the group over on the right-hand side, they're sort of carefully looking in certain directions, almost as carefully as a casual newspaper photograph is made today, where they crowd the people in much closer, and actually when it comes out in the photograph, they look sort of far apart. Slide, please. In close-up, in detail, we see a beautiful still life on the table. The lady sort of fondling the little lap dog. It's a beautiful bouquet on her bonnet, and the sort of sketchy, slashy style of the paint sort of built up in patchy areas. No certain direction, as we'll see in Cézanne. He's not quite as solid as Cézanne is in painting, but getting a quick impression of each object as you look around the painting. Renoir was much more concerned with the overall effect that you would have in looking at his paintings rather than, say, studying it or breaking it down into the proper compositional means. Slide, please. The other, almost a companion piece in size, a very major canvas of Renoir's, was called The Evening in Paris. And here you have the gas lights that sort of gave the light in these open-air parks or dance pavilions. People having fun in the evening, out on the town. And yet, as casual as all of this looks, the crowds, the activity in the painting, it is known that this also was posed for the artist. We'll see the couple in the far background to the left, to the lady in the pink dress. We'll even see the dress again in a later Renoir painting. The man that posed was also the same man that posed for him in the luncheon of the voting party. The lady in the pink and blue striped dress sitting on the park bench in front was Susan Valadon, who was an artist model, also an artist in her own right, and the mother of Maurice Utrillo, a later French Impressionist painter. We have the sort of dappled effect of light and dark in this one, but a beautiful painting, well composed, and yet it gives all the essence of beautiful French life in the late 19th century. Slide, please. I think one of the most delightful paintings Renoir ever did, one of my favorites, the little girl with the watering can. This is almost the complete composition, not quite. You see a little bit more of the flowers in the garden in the background. It seems that when any artist turns toward portraiture of children, as we've seen in Gainsborough and Goya, can't think of Velasquez, especially the Spanish court, there's a charm to it that does not get sentimental, not overly sticky as it might presenting an older person in such a manner. We've seen this little girl before in another painting, an arrangement in blues and the umbrellas with Renoir's. She had the same dress on, the same little girl, she had a bonnet on in that painting. So you see these things repeat over and over again, the artist using the same props, but changing the composition or the idea. The soft fuzziness of this, the delightful light that falls on her blonde hair, as it just sort of fuses out in curls, sort of a halo around the beautiful little face that is just translucent in color, that sort of vibrates beneath the skin tones. The lace, as with most Impressionist painters, is just a suggestion. Up close, it's sort of scratchy, slashy lines of white against a wet blue that sort of mingles together. And from a distance, it looks like a nice heavy lace banding against a dark blue coat or dress. Slide, please. In all the elegance and beauty, also a portrait. So he was confined within the characteristics of the sitter, but certainly crowding it within the stereotype of a perfect Renoir lady. The white skin, the sort of rusty brown hair, and the dark brown eyes set far apart. Slide, please. And a close-up of the detail of the face. Notice how the hair fuzzes off into the background. Lines are softened. There's sort of an atmospheric effect to Renoir's paintings. Slide, please. We'll see the bridge in the background again in another painting by Cézanne. Slide, please. As most of the painters traveled, Renoir also traveled to Venice. This is on the Grand Canal. Slide, please. And the young girl at her first opera, holding a little nosegay in the lower section of the painting, catching this sort of side view. The female form during Renoir's time was, the ideal female form was sort of on the plump side. So you have these rounded faces, sort of pinched in waist, but a fairly full figure. Slide, please. But all of Renoir's paintings are this sort of casual, elegant attitude. Slide, please. Artist's work that we will see today is by Odilon Redon, R-E-D-O-N. The slide on the screen is an early street scene by Redon. It does not depict completely his mature style, because it's fairly much a presentation, straightforward presentation, although the muted colors gives us some indication that he is going against the grain. Redon lived in the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, whose visionary mystical work established itself in a series of lithographs that he did approximately around the 1880s, 1890s. Slide, please. Redon really fits in no certain school, style, path whatsoever. He was at a time when most of the Impressionist painters were revolting against the strictness of the Academy, and yet he came a little bit too late to be considered within the Impressionist school himself. Much like some of the other painters, like Blake of the English school earlier, in the previous century, that he was a universal figure, that he would fit in almost any time pattern without any definite adherence to country or influence of the period that he lived in. Redon, you can assign him sort of as a colorist, but first of all, sort of a mystic quality, the same as Blake did, sort of a visionary of an otherworldliness. In technique, he wasn't as hazy or as fuzzy in the first things as the rest of the Impressionists. His colors were rich, but sort of an oddball combination of grayed and muted tones highlighted with sort of exaggerated intensities of different colors. He was influenced later on by his pastels that he worked in the same way, much the same way as Degas was influenced by the richness of colors in pastels. Slide, please. From a more academic background, Redon all of a sudden dropped painting, switched to lithography, and a whole series of things that had no beginning, no forewarning of what was to come, happened in his lithographs, all, of course, in black and white, no color. They look almost like charcoal sketches, but something from the fantasy mind, from the subconscious of a deep meaning of things, of an otherworldliness. Many of his things dealt with sort of facial features, eyes peering at you, or the head floating. He dismembered the body into sort of this mystical, magical world of his own. These are compelling things. They sort of frighten you, and at the same time, they sort of demand their attraction, your attraction to them. Today, with all of our psychedelic and pop art, we're used to such things as this happening in the world of art. But can you imagine how the lay people felt in looking at Redon's things in the 1890s when this series was produced. Slide, please. These floating, dismembered heads, these big-eyed people that would float majestically in the sky or in the clouds or in just sort of a softness of things that scattered around the composition. The size of these things were not too large. They were more like drawing size, but not overly large. Slide, please. But really creatures from a surreal world, something that we have seen possibly before in Bruegel or some of the early Flemish surrealist painters, Hieronymus Bosch, for example. These have a great feeling of the charcoal drawing with rubbing away, but again the dismembered head, this time attached to sort of a spidery body. Slide, please. There's a great quietness to Redon's work, as in this portrait, very similar to something that we would see by Degas. It has muted tones, it's drawn well, and yet we can see where the heads of the dismembered figures in the lithograph series, how similar they would be as to this portrait of this woman. His canvas is allowed to breathe. You don't have too much paint piled up, although in some instances he does sort of apply some sharp details with the painting knife. But you see the thinness of the paint by the texture of the canvas showing through. Slide, please. There's sort of not only the magic quality, but a great sort of classic quality to the lithograph head. There's a majesty to them. Slide, please. And then this same sort of magic, mystical quality starts appearing in his paintings, of where people might appear and disappear in just patches of color. There is no semblance of reality to his compositions. He, along with the other painters that were influenced by the Oriental art that was introduced into Paris at this time, the asymmetrics of the composition, the sort of lack of a ground line. But many of his things then proceed from this unreal world and depict also mythology, which again comes from another unreal world. Slide, please. His colors become very rich, flamboyant use of colors. This is slightly influenced by the Art Nouveau that was prevalent around the 1890s, the very end of the 19th century. Sort of a sensuous approach to art, where there were no harsh angles, but more curving, flowing lines. With the use of his pastels, highlighting his paint, he gets a very brilliant color scheme. Slide, please. But even depicting with some reality, you still have in the overall concept of the painting an unreal situation. Here the head, the beautiful sort of classic head, floats out of a bower of flowers that is just in a sort of a sun blaze of light that appears in the central portion of the composition, fading out into muted tones along the edges. But it is a dreamlike fantasy to his composition. We will see the flowers show up much later in some of his most delightful compositions, of where they're just simple vases of beautiful flowers presented. Slide, please. His flower paintings are my favorites of his work. He takes simple garden flowers in a fairly simple vase and presents them very elegantly on a very simple background. His placement is as carefully done as any Japanese or Chinese artist would carefully place every piece of the composition until the last little red dot of his signature over it would complete the composition. He will have many things sort of touching the edge, extending outward from the edge of the canvas, something that seems way off balance of a vase way over to the side. These are soft, muted colors, still rich, but muted. Slide, please. This is a portrait of his son. A fairly straightforward portrait, and then the whole background broken up into a fantasy of colors that suggest flowers and fields and patterns. He is not an impressionist because he just gives suggestions of things happening in the background. He does not try to portray the impression of what he sees, but it's a very imaginative use of the canvas. The form on the face is much like the early classic painters in the early period of Picasso at the turn of the century. A thin paint covering a fairly flat area, but a rich area of color, and then a very delicate but beautiful line sort of holding all the colors in place. Slide, please. Also, he returns to mythology time and again. Rich, beautiful colors. Slide, please. Slide, please. It's almost a Baroque attitude in many of his things. There's not much of a restful spot in a lot of the compositions, and yet they give sort of a very quiet attitude to the whole thing. You can see the canvas texture and sort of the flaming clouds above the horses in this one. Slide, please. The flower patterns become as individual and distinct as many other artists have made their own vocabulary of flowers and plant forms, such as Matisse or Renoir or Bonnard. He is closely aligned to Bonnard with his coloring. Slide, please. Slide, please. We're jumping back and forth with a mixture of pastels and his oil. This one's Tobias wrestling with the angel. Slide, please. Most of these things have a delicacy to them, even in the richness of color. Little floating textures, little objects appearing, disappearing. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. His paintings border on the surrealistic attitude, and yet he didn't have quite the concept of the surrealist painters. There was another sort of fantasy painter at the same time, Gustave Moreau, that gave a very rich sort of inventing his own world type of thing. The surrealists were more of an intellectual group. I think Redon is much more of an emotional painter, sort of presenting dream fantasies in color. Slide, please. Slide, please. His flower paintings are really beautiful. He obviously was well versed in drawing and presenting the things as simple as they are, in a simple form,
which gives them a great majesty. He is to flower paintings what Chardin was to kitchen objects. The paint's quite thin on these, almost washes and then just sort of little opaque highlight tones placed where they were needed. This is the full composition on this, of where it crowds out the sides of the canvases